Hello and welcome to the first episode of What's Wrong with Regularchap. I'm Regularchap. It is my intention with these recordings to give voice to the silent majority of reasonable people whose ideas and opinions have been more or less expunged from the public narrative. In each episode I shall take a topic, it could be a person, idea, institution, event, and ask, what's wrong with it? And for want of a more modest ambition, I shall begin by considering the topic of what's wrong with Western civilization. And the short answer to that is the rise of the midwit and the divisive ideologies and falsehoods which he promulgates. And for those of you not familiar with the term midwit, he is both the causal and transmissive agent of the cultural cancers that are killing Western European civilization, whether that be in Western Europe itself or its Anglophone offshoots in North America and the Antipodes. There is a war being waged by the woke left on reason and self-evident fact. Its foot soldiers are midwits, and they are winning. They have corrupted our schools, the police, universities, the civil service, arts organisations, human resource departments, and the media. The history and achievements of European civilization are being insulted and rewritten, while 1,000 years of relative ethnic and cultural cohesion, especially in Britain and northwestern Europe, is being demographically re-engineered in 2 generations through a programme of mass immigration about which those populations were never consulted and to which they never agreed. Despite majority discomfort with this mass immigration, it has been aggressively enforced through the false doctrine of multiculturalism, with dissenters silenced and branded as racists. The general population, multicultural or otherwise, is forced to genuflect to ever more absurd and malignant fictions with which they do not agree and know to not be true. Women can have male genitalia and men can have children. Sex is not determined at birth by X and Y chromosomes, but chosen by adolescents after watching YouTube videos. Individuals can choose to have no gender, a gender other than that of their birth, fluid genders, or even multiple genders. The more absurdly self-indulgent and ridiculous the claim, the more important that the claim be taken seriously. Some universities now allow students to identify as cats. The universal and entirely natural phenomenon of racism, which has existed in and between all races for all time, is in fact a sin unique to white people and only ever directed at black people. Such arguments are so contemptibly dishonest and stupid as to be deemed unworthy of rebuttal by intelligent people. But while we shake our heads in disbelief, the midwits, either through cynicism or stupidity, continue to prosecute this nonsense as if it were true. This degenerate drivel is now pumped out remorselessly by The Guardian, the BBC, the New York Times, and even by our entirely corrupted universities. You might think that anyone with half a brain must be aware that dark-complexioned people oppress dark-complexioned people in India, Africa, and elsewhere, and have done as long as they have existed, just as white people have enslaved other white people. Black Africans were enslaving black Africans for thousands of years before Western Europeans provided additional markets for their victims. The oil-rich Arab autocracies of today still practice slavery in all but name, not to mention medieval levels of misogyny, homophobia and racism. Historically, the great drivers of the trade in sub-Saharan Africans were Arabs, long before the Portuguese, Dutch and other European nations established the transatlantic slave routes. Black African slaves worked on the pyramids of Egypt and were to be found throughout the Roman Empire. Black people can also be enthusiastic racists themselves, as of course can Asians and Arabs. You won't find many British Bangladeshis dating the British blacks they live among, just as you won't find many African or European citizens in Japan or China. Indeed, China is, to all intents and purposes, a massive racist exercise in the promotion of the Han Chinese. But a balanced discussion of these issues, based on historical truth and present reality, would not serve these race Bolshevists, whose clear aim is to corrupt, undermine and control Western civilization. Among the peoples of the world, there is an almost infinite range of racial mixes and skin colours who identify with an equally diverse range of cultural and religious idioms. There is no definition as to what or who constitutes black people. Is a white Afrikaner black because he is African and his ancestors were oppressed by the British? Is a South African Cape-coloured, black, Asian or European? Because they all have dark skin and come from Africa, are the Kalahari Bushman, Kenyan Maasai, Nigerian Christian, Moroccan Jew and Egyptian Muslim all part of a common black experience? I don't suppose any of the campus-based Western midwits who promulgate critical race theory and its mutant epigonias have ever bothered to ask them. Why would they? The truth is ideology's nemesis. Does the half-white, university-educated, American-raised Barack Obama really speak for the Congolese pygmy, the Brazilian mulatto, and the modern black American descendant of sharecroppers? The term blackness, as used by the woke left, is a political construct, an abstract notion, not an ethnic, cultural or racial reality, and nor is it a common experience, any more than there is such a thing as whiteness. To attempt to conflate the Russian serf, the Icelandic fisherman, the Ashkenazi Jew and the English aristocrat as being members of a common project of oppression or of having a common experience is manifestly absurd. This, however, does not prevent an individual who has, say, majority European heritage identifying as black. His appearance may be predominantly white European and his upbringing mostly among white Europeans, but still we must accept his assertion that he is black, and that despite the term having no meaning. Similarly, we must accept the manifest nonsense of a male teenager saying that he has always felt like a woman. This type of logical absurdity and self-contradiction is typical of woke ideology. Their assertions are disproved by their own dogma. To claim that you feel like a woman presumes that there is such a thing as a common experience particular to women. Yet woke ideology maintains that there is no such thing as a woman, seeing as they can also be men and vice versa. Thus woke gender ideology rests on an implicit self-contradiction, namely that you can claim to be one gender rather than another, while simultaneously claiming that there are no such things as fixed genders. And that is further complicated by woke ideologues claiming that the experiences of black and white people, despite there being no such real-world categories, are insurmountably different. Thus a white male teenager clearly cannot feel like a black woman, who of course may herself be neither black nor a woman. Now, if you rightly think that should be the stuff of satire, bear in mind that it is being taught in schools, universities, the civil service, and promoted by the BBC, the Health Service and police. The sociopathic zealots of Stonewall, Black Lives Matter and other such crypto-Marxist pressure groups are allowed to inculcate into impressionable young children biological lies and historical falsehoods, whose explicit end is self-harm, social division and intellectual corruption. Confused or unhappy children are encouraged to make decisions that can have irreversible medical and surgical consequences in the false belief it will solve their problems. White children are emotionally blackmailed with fake historical guilt, and black children encouraged to be resentful, angry victims. Neo-Bolshevist pressure groups, such as Stonewall and Black Lives Matter, are far more dangerous than many prescribed organisations that encourage neo-Nazi or Islamic extremism. Black Lives Matter is a hateful, racist and corrupt organisation which encourages division, riots and violence, while explicitly calling for the defunding of the police and the dismantling of Western capitalism. Quite how their taking the knee gesture came to be seen as a signal of moral virtue and to be publicly practised by uniformed police officers and even our national football team is a measure of how inverted our morality has become. Black Lives Matter openly incites violence against the police and property, and the police are kneeling to it. In a morally sane universe, Stonewall, Black Lives Matter and their ilk would be banned and their advocates imprisoned. Yet this child abuse is being encouraged and paid for by the very institutions that should be curating the minds of young people. These poisonous ideologies have been allowed to dictate real-world decisions and even laws across our societies. The leader of the British Labour Party, tipped to be the next Prime Minister, is too frightened of them to be prepared to say whether or not a man can have a cervix. National Health Service staff are now required to ask men if they are pregnant prior to administering drugs which can damage the fetus in utero. And this in a country that produced Newton, Darwin, split the atom, discovered penicillin, deciphered the DNA double helix, and which has made huge contributions across the sciences. The National Health Service has also begun removing the word woman from information specific to women. The judicial system now incarcerates convicted male sex offenders in women's prisons should that man choose, post hoc, to claim to be a woman. This is the subordination of scientific and medical reality, not to mention grammatical sense, to the demands of a tiny but very shrill minority of sociopaths. Black children are being taught to believe that they are discriminated against, disadvantaged, and bear a duty to feel resentment to the white majority among whom they live. White children are being fed the vile, divisive lie that they are inherently prejudiced and part of a universal and historical project of oppression. This is a deliberate attempt to foment racial tension and disharmony by disseminating critical race theory from the Trojan horse of a phony equality and inclusion narrative. Far from outlawing these ideas from the curriculum and public service, not to mention public dialogue, they are financed, enabled and encouraged by the state and its agencies. At the latest count, the British government employs around 10,000 diversity and inclusion officers at an annual salary bill of over £500 million. Their role in promoting social cohesion mirrors that of Stalin's NKVD in the Soviet Union. This is not the stuff of some dystopian horror story. It is our present reality in Britain and the United States in particular. Unfortunately, what black actually means in this warped Marxist lexicon is victim or oppressed individual. According to the progressive left, you cannot be black unless you are a victim, and if you are white, you are an oppressor. In the mind of the midwit, no doubt, this satisfactorily explains the experience and behaviour of both African kleptocrat dictators with their Swiss bank accounts and Parisian mansions, and also that of white working-class girls who are sexually exploited by Asian paedophile rapists. Social media, academia, public performance, literature and the visual arts are now policed by neo-Maoist bigots for sins, real and imagined, against these mad dictates. Hate crime legislation has been introduced in which the crime is defined entirely subjectively by the self-proclaimed victim on the basis of whether or not they find someone or something offensive. Thus, a non-black person who identifies as black can confer criminal status upon anyone or anything he doesn't like without any evidence. People are now routinely removed from their jobs and have their livelihoods destroyed on the basis of allegations rather than any proof they have committed a crime. The accusation of rape or racism, for example, is sufficient for an actor, author or public figure to be stood down, suspended or cancelled altogether without any due process as to whether the accusation is well-founded, let alone proven in a court of law. Thus we get such tyrannically insane mantras as believe all women. Yet none of the progressive protection agencies which interacted with them listened to the white working class girls being systematically raped in numerous British cities for over a decade, presumably because their rapists were Muslim immigrants with brown skin. You only believe all women when you are trying to take down a rich, ideally conservative, white man. Recent high-profile examples of the latter could include the destruction of Woody Allen's career, autobiography and reputation, or the imprisonment and inhuman mental torture of Julian Assange, both on entirely confected allegations of sexual abuse. To enforce the acceptance of this sick tyranny, linguistic niceties are invented at a dizzying rate to increase the possibilities for transgression. A fisherman becomes a fisher, a slave becomes an enslaved person, and coloured people become persons of colour. The synonyms of gender and sex, which are of course the same thing and determined by the presence or absence of X and Y chromosomes at conception, are suddenly separated and given different meanings to be relentlessly policed by sociopaths. Similarly, man and woman, two of the most fundamental words in the lexicon of our self-understanding, no longer have any meaning whatsoever. This idiocy now proliferates throughout our society with the sole objective of catching out the unwary and thus enabling these Maoist perverts to charge the innocent transgressor with some form of bigotry. The Twitter mob are the woke equivalent of Stalin's secret police. To the trans rights Gestapo, speaking scientific truth is equivalent to hiding Jews. The destruction of language, abuse of meaning and denial of common sense are the go-to weapons of totalitarian sociopaths who seek to confuse, humiliate and police the decent, reasonable majority. Once they have exiled truth, reason and belief in self-evident fact, they can consolidate their control over the orgy of unreason that excites them. It was, of course, the ideological bigotry of the left that in the 20th century alone gave rise to the torture, imprisonment and murder of hundreds of millions of people. The writings of Karl Marx have arguably propagated more evil than those of any man to have ever lived. The Nazis, it is important to remember, were socialists, and the foundation of socialism is always ideological tyranny, whether you be Hitler, Mao or Stalin. The current imposition of woke, race, gender and climate ideology is a mutant form of revolutionary socialism and will ultimately prove to be even more destructive. Today's Jew-baiting boot boys are the trans rights, BLM and Just Stop Oil activists, and they have succeeded in intimidating Western society all the way up to the pinnacle of its power, as embodied in the senile Joe Biden. The ironically named progressives of the left will make you speak nonsense, deny reality, and support them in their quest to control a racially divided, culturally degenerate society. They are not just toppling statues, they are toppling truth, erasing history, and destroying beauty. Because women who wish to pretend to be men and to be taken seriously while doing so wish to use the men's toilets, these toilets must be renamed as the grammatical nonsense that is a male toilet, lest it be construed that they are toilets for men. In that usage, male is an adjective, and thus ascribes a gender not to the user of the toilet, but to the toilet itself. This is a thrilling victory for the woke midwit. Even our schools, National Health Service and universities now believe that some toilets are born male and others female. And it gets better. An individual can decide that they have multiple genders and insist upon the grammatical and logical nonsense of being referred to in the plural. If you fail or refuse to comply with this deranged narcissistic demand, they can accuse you of a hate crime. Indeed, the preceding two sentences alone could get me removed from a major media platform and potentially investigated for the recently invented nonsense that is a non-crime hate incident, and that in turn would leave me with a police record. Clearly, this is a paradise for the nastiest types of liars, snitches and resentful inadequates who can prosecute their vicious impulses by making slanderous and damaging accusations, whether they be false or true. This climate of fear and absurdity is not redolent of Stalinism without reason. It is Stalinist. Frequently, this perversely self-titled progressive ideology should be the stuff of satire. Recently, for example, one of the candidates for co-leader of the Green Party in the United Kingdom was one Tamsin Omond. This person identifies as trans non-binary, which probably means he's a bloke with mental health issues, and certainly means nothing to 99% of the electorate. This created an interesting problem for the Green Party, as its rules require, not unreasonably, that co-leaders be of different genders, i.e. one be a man and the other a woman. However, in this case, Omond thinks he is both a he and a she at the same time as being neither, and also considers himself to be plural despite being single-bodied. Quite how this doesn't constitute grounds of being sectioned is remote to me, let alone how someone so manifestly mentally ill could possibly be considered for political office. However, it amusingly brings this absurdity up against some inconvenient realities. At what point will a male child who identifies as a princess insist that his teachers refer to him as Your Royal Highness? Will we soon see LGBTQ+P earnestly waved on flags by the police? Should Scientologists be allowed to have alien written on their birth certificate in place of a gender? If I feel that I am actually an aristocrat born in the wrong body, which, incidentally, I do, should the National Health Service provide me with an estate and a title, and the law protect my right to be addressed as your lordship? Should I be granted a seat in the House of Lords along with the appropriate stipend? In the case of Ormond, a trans non-binary, plurally pronounced politician, the small matter of how many seats, or indeed votes, a plural individual should have, has yet, as far as I am aware, to be established. Will they be referred to by the Speaker as the Right Honourable Members? That should be a joke, but it is one among countless examples of this idiocy being prosecuted at the highest levels of our society. The only good thing about it is that the Green Party, which despite the widespread sympathy for the environment in this country and the hysterical concern for climate change, has managed to retain only one seat in Parliament over the last 12 years. It is not hard to see why. This toxic stupidity has reached the very core of our civilization. Heretics who resist the Stalinist imposition of these lies and absurdities are cancelled, debate is silenced, truth subverted, and reason betrayed. As language and meaning are mangled, so all forms of creativity are crushed until subordinate to the hideous kitsch of formulaic woke propaganda. Movies and television dramas are now expositions of a progressive fantasy in which women are dominant, sassy and aggressive, half the population is gay or unsure of its gender, white men are uniformly stupid or racist, heterosexuals are a dysfunctional minority, and all people of colour uniformly wise, compassionate, in every way superior to all white characters. Theatre and comedy have been reduced to little more than virtue-signalling lectures on woke ideology, with the only legitimate targets for ridicule being white male conservatives. Works of great literature are removed from syllabuses because they may offend these confected sensibilities. Museum exhibits carry trigger warnings, works of art are interrogated to find dogmatic corruption so that they can be removed, and the consensus is that nobody should have to look at anything they don't like, apart from heterosexual white men, who must gorge on false histories and make forced confessions of invented historical guilt. Many of our top universities now require students to sign a written commitment to this ideology before they are allowed to enrol. This amounts to a commitment to not think or speak freely. It is indicative of the sordid degeneracy of this bigoted and intolerant totalitarianism that its proponents describe themselves as progressive and liberal. In the last general election in the United Kingdom, the Liberal Democrats campaigned on the promise to cancel the result of a democratic referendum because they disagreed with it. In other words, explicitly illiberal and anti-democratic. Similarly, the phony creed of inclusivity for largely invented minorities is actually a project to exclude the sane, white, heterosexual and English majority from their own culture and history, while diversity is a sick label for the totalitarian imposition of thought and speech control. The woke left do not tolerate diversity of opinion. This hypocrisy is one of the defining characteristics of so-called progressive liberalism, which is, of course, regressive and illiberal. Other features include specious arguments, false statements, hyperbole, and catastrophization. The proponents of all progressive ideologies are midwits. Their defining characteristics are ignorance of the subjects upon which they express their opinions, the inability to think for themselves, and a complete intolerance of opinions different to their own. Because progressive ideologies are incompatible with the truth, and their proponents cannot defend them, they are viciously opposed to debate. Instead, all dissenting voices must be drowned out in a hail of irrelevant personal abuse, slander, and false allegation. This is the root of cancel culture, namely that woke narcissists are offended by the truth, so it must be silenced and replaced with lies and specious arguments. Entry to universities is no longer determined solely by academic merit, but also through so-called contextualized offers. This is a progressive euphemism for denying legitimately earned places to high-achieving white males from fee-paying schools, while granting admission to candidates who haven't earned it, who hail from supposedly disadvantaged backgrounds. In other words, contextualised offers are a tool with which to subordinate academic merit and objective assessment to the political requirement that university intake should conform to progressive ideology as expressed in the form of diversity quotas. Literary prizes are now awarded on the basis of the identity credentials of the writer, as opposed to the artistic merit of what they write. The 2019 Booker Prize for Literature was awarded to Bernardine Evaristo. The accompanying media frenzy focused exclusively on how she was the first black British woman to win it, with almost no serious critical assessment of the literary value of her book, nor indeed of her spurious claim to being black. She has a white mother, grew up in a predominantly white milieu in what was then a predominantly white city, namely London, and is without question the worst writer to ever win the prize. Her book, Girl, Woman, Other, is little more than an ill-written recital of progressive identitarian drivel, which as a work of literature ranks right up there with the thoughts of Xi Jinping. She can't write and has nothing to say. Her book is not literature, it is propaganda. Despite this, she has been elevated to wealth and stardom and bombarded with every available honour. It is inconceivable that such rubbish would have ever made it into print 50 years ago, let alone win a major literary award. The sorry irony being that such accolades awarded to a fake black non-writer are the most profound insult to the accomplishments of genuinely talented, genuinely black women writers, such as Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison, who must be turning in their graves. This midwitry is not progressive, it is regressive. The irony of this political patronage is that it doesn't advance the contribution of black women or anyone else to literature. Quite the reverse. It hinders it. Real writers and artists are horrified by the promotion of this type of hideous propaganda, while fake, talentless, identarian midwits are encouraged to mimic it. Outside the echo chamber of progressive virtue signallers, the majority of the reading public see straight through this politicised nonsense, and rather than believing the propaganda, rightly assume that Evaristo won the award for successfully and shamelessly playing identity politics, rather than for the quality of her writing. This phenomenon is now universal among the arts and beyond, where people from so-called minorities are rewarded without appropriate achievement. Perhaps the most egregious example was the decision of the Nobel Prize Committee to award its Peace Laureate to Barack Obama after only 9 months in office. He went on, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria and Libya, among others, to be the most interventionist, warmongering and murderous US president in a generation. The Nobel Prize Committee specifically applauded Obama for reaching out to the Muslim world, which is the darkest of ironies, as during his presidency, the United States military and its proxies killed, or caused the deaths of, more Muslims than in any other period of its history. Obama's legacy also included the instigation of the largest build-up of US nuclear weapons since Ronald Reagan. Indeed, Barack Obama, by every real-world metric, was a far more cynical and murderous president than Donald Trump, or either of the Bushes. But facts have never dented his enduring and totemic popularity with the progressive liberal virtue signallers, who are, of course, all midwits. In truth, Obama was really lauded for being America's first black president, even though the American part of him was, via his mother, white European, and the black part of him, via his father, East African. In other words, he was not really a black American at all, and had no right to claim common inheritance with the descendants of enslaved black Americans. Perversely, the application of woke ideology would suggest that, if anything, as a result of his ethnicity, upbringing and education, Barack Obama was, and remains, a pretty good example of white privilege. This subordination of ability and track record to fetishised and largely confected identity credentials now extends to all senior public offices, political candidates and corporate boardrooms across Western Europe and North America. It is commonplace to have women-only selection lists of political candidates. Positions are now routinely filled in obeisance to diversity quotas and political virtue signalling rather than the merit of the candidates. In corporate boardrooms, for example, better qualified men are routinely passed over for less well qualified women in the interest of increasing the number of women on the board. It is probably fair to say of all female chief executive officers of FTSE 100 companies that had their CV been presented by a man, he would never have made the interview list. The trouble with elevating individuals beyond their competence and at the expense of those more deserving is that rather than encourage excellence and aspiration among so-called underrepresented groups, it actually encourages professional identitarians and fosters suspicion of the ability of those individuals from such backgrounds who actually do advance on merit. In Britain, the once globally respected BBC has embraced woke ideology in all its output, and despite the overwhelming majority of the British public who fund it disagreeing with that ideology. From grotesquely distorted and selective news coverage to every aspect of its comedy, sports coverage, drama and documentaries, the BBC has become a shameless, unelected and unalloyed propaganda outlet for this malignant dogma, which aims to rewrite, discredit and erase 1,000 years of English history and its unparalleled cultural achievements. It is no exaggeration to say that if there is one existential threat to Western civilization, to beauty, truth and social harmony, it is not climate change, it is not racism, it is not even presidency of China, it is woke politics. Because let us understand this absolutely, woke ideology, in all its myriad lies, contradictions and insanities, is nothing more than a recrudescence of the Marxist project of revolution through division. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the protagonists of that murderous movement, which justified the murder of tens of millions by Mao, Stalin and Pol Pot, among others, sought to foment conflict between the invented tribes of workers and bosses. Following the collapse of that catastrophic project, a new generation of sociopathic narcissists, perverts and inadequates is seeking to transpose the false narrative of oppressor and oppressed onto the equally confected categories of race and various invented minorities, minority being woke code for a victim group. Whites, especially white heterosexual men, are the new bosses. The objective, self-evidently, is not cogent argument, but revolution and the overthrow of the democratic and meritocratic nation-state, the debasement of the Western cultural legacy, and its replacement by a woke elite running supranational polities by fear. Diversity, as these psychopaths know, is division, and globalism the corporate antidote to democracy. This is why midwits are universally in favour of the anti-democratic corporatist theme park that is the European Union. By publishing this essay and articulating the reasonable views held by a significant proportion of Western electorates, I am at risk of a call from the police for potentially engaging in the non-crime of hate speech and thus being effectively rendered a dissident. This is exactly what happened in Central and Eastern Europe under communism. Informers and snitches were invaluable threads in the web of fear and suspicion woven by the secret police. In the once superbly civilised Czechoslovakia, doctors were unable to practice medicine if they refused to join the Communist Party, and writers who criticised the regime were either hounded into exile or forced to risk imprisonment by passing around hand-typed manuscripts to their fellow dissidents. This totalitarian nightmare, which only ended in 1989, almost ruined that admirable country, as it very nearly did many others. Barely have we finished celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall before we are once again sleepwalking into another version of the same nightmare. Woke censorship is now almost complete. Truth and reason are fugitive. Today's apparatchiks are the midwits. Once again they are banning books, hounding academics and artists, and all the while bombarding us with woke propaganda. Their vituperative spewings fill the pages of The Guardian, The New York Times and the BBC. They are the imbeciles and cynics running education, museums, theatres and creative industries. They are in corporate human resource departments, they are in the civil service and in Parliament, and in the rare cases where they were elected at all, they were almost certainly never elected to prosecute woke ideology. It is a characteristic of the demented hypocrisy of the woke left that they only accept democratic outcomes when they align with their ideological ambitions. When they do not, such as the vote to leave the European Union or the election of Donald Trump, they immediately allege foul play, election meddling and disinformation, usually from Russia. The irony being that if Vladimir Putin or President Xi of China wish to destabilise the West, which undoubtedly they do, they would not encourage the integrity of the nation-state, nor conservative governments, but encourage the conflict, disabling stupidity and divisiveness promoted by woke ideology. If you wanted to design a Trojan horse for Putin or Xi, it would not be Brexit, but Black Lives Matter. Shortly after his inauguration, the diversity apparatchiks of the Democratic Party celebrated President Biden's appointment of America's first four-star transsexual general in the US military. The progressive media and virtue-signalling politicians gushed generously on the enormous significance of this milestone in America's journey towards inclusivity and fairness. Shortly afterwards, Biden withdrew US troops from Afghanistan abruptly and unilaterally, precipitating an humanitarian catastrophe and consigning millions of women to a barbarous misogyny worthy of the Dark Ages. This type of selective morality and hypocrisy is systemic to progressive ideology, as is the virtue signalling. It is also unlikely that the appointment of a transsexual general did much to discourage Putin from invading Ukraine. Woke campus nonsense has real-world consequences. This is why it is imperative to understand the nature of the midwit, how he operates and where he is to be found, so that he can be identified, his lies rebutted, and his cultural vandalism reversed. My next episode will attempt to begin this by looking more closely at the intellectual and psychological deficiencies of the midwit and what drives him towards these poisonous and absurd ideologies. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you have heard, please like, subscribe and share. We do need to push back. I'm Regularchap, and this is What's Wrong.